First and foremost, no asthmatic who probably has COVID is going to be able to run that far for that long during a shootout, but let's get into it. Eddington is the newest movie from American auteur slash A24 favorite Ari Aster, but this neo-Western drama sees him working in a different register that you might expect from his previous horror films. Taking place in late May of 2020, the film revolves around the small town of Eddington, New Mexico, where community members are finding themselves increasingly at odds with one another over mask mandates, the Black Lives Matter movement, and a variety of other dog-whistling culture wars. Our protagonist is Sheriff Joe Cross, played by Joaquin Phoenix, who's already fed up with the COVID precautions put in place by the town's mayor, Ted Garcia, played by Pedro Pascal. When Joe announces that he's running for mayor in the upcoming election, it's the first of many political dominoes that fall and disturb the people of Eddington, including Joe's own wife, Louise, played by Emma Stone. Unrest and violence build, conspiracy theories and social media exaggerations run amok, and the town is doomed to be divided forever. You got it. At 2.5 hours, Eddington all but promises to expose America's ills in shocking and significant ways, but it's a surprisingly empty movie. The film sets you up to be ready for a massive political showdown between Joe and Ted, a cultural clash that will span the whole town, but the mayoral face-off is kind of a dud. Pedro Pascal gets shockingly little screen time for a would-be antagonist, and it's a shame because he does good work. He plays the kind of virtue-signaling liberal who cares about image above all else, calling a woman a bitch once he's muted on Zoom and eschewing his mask in areas where he probably should still have it on. Instead of capitalizing on that characterization and sort of crafting it into something that could say something, a lot of the movie ends up focusing on a sulking and fairly pathetic Joaquin Phoenix, a role which the actor is no stranger to. He's petty and a little dumb, and he honestly doesn't change very much at all during the runtime, but none of the characters really do. In that way, the movie sort of functions as an attempt at painting a strange and uncanny tableau of a hyper-specific moment in time in America, poking fun at things rather than pointing them out. There are bits of Eddington that succeed in this sort of poking fun, and that made me laugh in the theater, and the film clearly tries to weave some off-kilter satire into its story, but tries is the operative word there, with some more on that later. Ari Aster's most effective stab at comedy comes with a genuinely pitch-perfect scene that devolves into Joaquin Phoenix and Pedro Pascal glaring at each other while trying to control the volume of Katy Perry's firework at a campaign event. Everything you could possibly get out of this movie is summed up and distilled perfectly in this scene as these men engage in a supreme battle of wills over a top 40 pop song about self-esteem and occasional onomatopoeia. This funnier sensibility also crops up with Austin Butler's performance as a conspiracy-pilled cult leader. His first appearance is via a webpage that just screams graphic design prowess. And though his earnest bullshit spouting isn't like a knee slapper, the pure nonsense of it still made me chuckle quite a bit. He's probably in like 10 minutes tops, but Austin Butler is just so intense and magnetic that I would have been fine if this was a subplot that added to the film's runtime rather than just like a glorified cameo.
This is the end of history. We are all of us collectively hurtling toward a new reality, and this current reality is evil. It is purely capitalistic. It is anti-community. It is anti-human. It is pure and cold and evil, and we have to change this now, before we program the AI with this.
Again, it's weird that so many of the movie's acting heavy hitters barely factor into the movie. Even Emma Stone's character disappears after Joe crosses a line very early on in the mayoral race. It tracks a little bit more once Eddington starts to coalesce around another conflict, but unfortunately, said conflict is the lesser of Ari Aster's attempts at satire. While the COVID-19 culture wars rage, the impact of the killing of George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter movement makes its way to Eddington almost entirely via the town's small population of white teens. The movie wants you to point and laugh at these terminally online activists for pulling focus, even as they themselves admit that they have no right to be speaking on these issues as white kids. The leftist self-flagellation doesn't really go anywhere, and it mostly just serves to provide some eye-roll-worthy lines, like a back and forth that these teens tell themselves that they can't ever hope to be anti-racist. The best they can hope for is to be white traitors. Sure. There's also somehow a teenage love triangle in the midst of all of this, which only compounds the issue that Ari Aster kind of has no idea how to write people from Gen Z. He's far from the only one in the history of cinema to write unrealistic teens, but it's way more glaring when you base so much of your movie on them. It's also really ironic that Eddington satirizes these privileged teenagers for making societal tragedies about themselves when the movie itself does very little to flesh out its own minority and oppressed characters. Michael Ward plays Mike, seemingly the only black person in all of Eddington and one of Sheriff Joe's fellow officers. There are moments when the movie sits with the complex emotions that Mike is feeling as he reckons with his race and his profession, but they're purposefully interrupted by characters on either side of the political spectrum, telling him how to feel and how to react. It really beats you over the head with this idea that people are speaking over those with actual lived experience of oppression, but then the movie is just content to leave it at that. Mike gets a few stuttered lines and meaningful looks, which Michael Ward does his best with, but the film overshadows his characters just as much as the figures it's lampooning. There's also the fact that the female characters are all essentially stupid or ignorant sex objects for men to fight over, and I can already see people making the point that this is just Ari Aster highlighting the male character's own sexism and misogynistic worldview, but let's be real, that would require an actual discussion and depiction of women that didn't depend on who's fucked who. This is all to say that Eddington's take on America doesn't really go anywhere or contribute anything new. The movie ends with a massive shootout because that's what all Westerns have to climax with. But it's made pretty boring by the fact that we have no idea who Sheriff Joe and co are fighting. There's a straight up dumb inclusion of maybe Antifa extremists who suddenly take an interest in the town, though their politics are vague at best. There's just a sprinkle of interesting gore during this shootout, but since we don't know who this shadowy enemy is, it all just feels incredibly pointless. I really can't fathom why Ari Aster would introduce such villains at the end of his movie, especially when it seems like the movie was largely built on the divisions from within the town itself, and this all really just blunts the impact that this finale could have had. Ultimately, it's a shrug of a movie. There are some very good parts and some very bad parts, but I can't see myself ever feeling the need to revisit this film. I'd give it 2.5 out of 5 stars. Watch if you're a Joaquin Phoenix or Austin Butler completionist, but there's not much to get out of Eddington otherwise.
Thank you super duper very much.